Let me put it this way. What we see consistently is that in the last quarter of the year, for the government, the accounts working from the 1st of April to the 31st of March, that means January, February and March. Ironically, the first quarter of the calendar year is the last quarter of the government financial year. We see how spending spikes in respect of a number of different areas. Spending, departmental expenditure in relation to the acquisition of things which have not been acquired earlier in the year, and also in respect of overtime. And therefore, the important thing is to ensure that we control that across the board. In respect of overtime in particular, it doesn't make any sense to see overtime spiking in these 3 months, and therefore it's important that we control overtime to what I think most people will believe overtime to be for things that need to be done outside of hours, not just things that are chosen to be done outside of hours, unless there's a very good reason why that might be the case.
Is it particularly bad this year, 2016, because I've been speaking to civil servants and it seems that this practice is commonplace and it's been going on since time immemorial, really. That's heads of department think that they have to spend their money in the last quarter. Is it particularly acute this year?
No, this year the problem is not acute, because on the 5th of December, I spoke to all the controlling officers and told them that I would not tolerate this continued spiking of expenditure. And of course, all generalizations are wrong, including this one. But when I spoke to the controlling officers, it was very clear to me, and I made very clear to them, that not all controlling officers, and controlling officers are people who control the spending in each department, are guilty of these in my view, abuses, but in most instances we see that there is a spike in this last quarter. Now, what I've said, and let's be clear about this, the government didn't issue a statement on this subject. GBC asked questions on the subject, to which the government replied. What I think is unacceptable is that the urban myth having grown up that you have to spend everything that you have been voted for in the last quarter, because if you don't spend it, then you might find that you get less money next year. Look, the money of the taxpayer of Gibraltar is there to be spent on the things that we need spent on. It's not there to be thrown away. And traditionally in the last quarter, I'm not suggesting anybody throws money away, but they certainly do their best to spend the full amount of their vote, so that in the following year's budget, the amount which any department gets would only grow or stay the same but not shrink. And what I've said to the controlling officers is, look, you will have the money that you need. If next year you need more than this year, although this year you didn't spend as much as you had been voted, that's not going to be an issue. We're going to work on the basis of ensuring that you have the money that you need to spend. But there's absolutely no need, and in my view, no justification for in the last quarter acquiring things which are not absolutely necessary simply for the purposes of reaching that spending target, or spending more on overtime than is necessary in order to reach that spending target.
Is there an actual definition, because the GGCA of course says that there isn't, of what constitutes non-essential and essential overtime?
It would be impossible to have strict definitions of these things. There are, for example, things which we call conditioned overtime, where it has been agreed between the government and a particular department, usually because a union has been involved in making the negotiations work, that there should be overtime which is agreed because the manning level may not be right, the government doesn't want to agree to increase manning levels, and so we say, well, fair enough, let's do this. Let's ensure that we give you a few more hours a day to fill up the work that might have been done by another. That's beneficial to the government because you have one less post in the public sector, and it's beneficial to the individuals in that department because they are able to share a little bit extra, but that makes sense. It's conditioned overtime, and that's why it works in that way. Now, what is essential and what is not essential is really a matter for a head of department, and very often in consultation with a relevant minister. Do we need to do this? There are times in each month since we were elected when there are questions in Parliament, and we have to have people stay behind and ensure that the information is provided in the timescale provided. That is normal in all Westminster-style democracies where you have question times. It's necessary because there's a ministerial deadline to answer a question. There are other reasons for essential overtime. When something goes wrong and it has to be fixed within a particular period. If you're coming to the end of the financial year, for example, there is, of course, a good reason to make sure that the estimates are completed, etc. So spiking in that respect, in that period, would also make sense. If it wasn't, the spike doesn't just represent those working towards ensuring that estimates are completed. It represents many more people. So these issues have to be understood in that context. It's not a question of alleging that the public sector doesn't provide value for money. I've demonstrated in the time I've been Chief Minister that I fully back and respect the work done by our civil servants, by our public sector, the wider public sector, as much as by the core civil service. I've invested in it. Salaries have continued to go up because I think it's important to continue to reward that hard work, but we must deal with issues where we don't think that the right application of the rules is there. And I'm surprised to have been criticized by the opposition on this, who say there's £50 million of waste and yet are concerned that I'm trying to control this particular area of expenditure.
The opposition are also saying that if the government needs to tighten up on overtime, then you should also be doing so with ministerial expenses like the use of VIP lounges at airports and entertainment expenses. Are you going to do that?
Look, I don't know what it is that they think that they're talking about, but Mr. Yamas, who made the criticism, obviously has no political history in his head to think about, because he needs to look at how much we have restrained the expenditure. He needs to look at how much less than the former GSD administration I have used the relevant lounge that he's referring to, how much more we have flown with budget airlines, and how much less the fleet of vehicles that he's referring to costs than the previous fleet of vehicles, because we bought hybrid vehicles and we ensure that GSLP Liberal ministers, by the way, do carpooling, something that GSD ministers didn't do. So I think when you put all that into the equation, we have already applied to ourselves the standard since we were elected in December 2011 of not wasting. We are now ensuring that those few areas of the public service where we need to ensure better spending are properly controlled. We do not believe that there is the sort of waste that the GSD were talking about, which they would have implemented controls for, which would have resulted in effect, austerity coming to Gibraltar. But at the same time, where there is what we believe to be abuse, we will restrain that and ensure it is properly reined in. Look, if Mr. Yamas doesn't agree with that, I don't know what it is that he would agree with, because £50 million of cuts would have meant not just not using the VIP lounge and controlling overtime, it would have meant cutting jobs, it would have meant cutting services. That's what he stood for election for. He shouldn't criticize the GSLP Liberal administration for being careful with how taxpayers' money is spent in respect of overtime.
Well, the government is owed £6 million in housing rent. Are you going to pursue people who aren't paying their rents with the same vigour as you're going to try and control spending on overtime?
No, with much more vigour. And that is the process that we have commenced some time ago under our former administration. And of course, the issue here is, Stephen, that the GSD did away with the central arrears unit, the responsibility of which was to deal with exactly these issues. So when I'm elected, I find the growing debt, I find a lot of the debt is falling outside the period in which one is legally able to collect, because the 6 million, much of the 6 million is older than 6 years and therefore you cannot collect it. And I'm left without a central arrears unit because it was disbanded by the GSD that now criticizes me for not collecting the debt. So I'm going to do a lot more. Now, if you want a berth from the government in the new marina, you're going to have no debt, because you're going to have to pay your debts to ensure that you're continue to be eligible. We're going to roll that sort of mechanism out in respect to a lot of other areas. So if you want an advantage from the government, for example, if you want to continue renting a parking space from us and we find that you have arrears, we'll tell you that we're going to terminate your parking if you don't pay your arrears. We're going to change the limitation period so that we're able to pursue people for arrears that are older than 6 years. And there's a whole array of other things that will be coming on stream to enable us to fix the problem that we were landed with when we were elected in 2011 and which we were not able to fix before now, because we even had the tools taken away to resolve those problems. But we are very much in the process of fixing those. The government will be making separate statements about these issues. People who pay their rent do not deserve to live next to people who do not pay their rent for exactly the same tenement, but we must also consider that there are some people who cannot pay their rent, and those who cannot pay their rent will be helped to ensure that they are claiming their allowances, because out of the 6 million you might find that some people have got a huge liability simply because it hasn't registered with one part of the system and another that this person has a problem, that they are unable to work, not because they're just unemployed, but they may be physically unable to work. They are entitled to a rent relief, and a debt of £20,000 may actually just be an arrear of £500 or £600 when you apply the rent relief, which can be dealt with in another way. All of those things in respect of this very complex area are very much in hand, and I think people who pay their dues will be very proud of the way that my government is going to deal with this issue. issue in a way that also looks after those who cannot pay.
But reserves do stand at £16 million, and the GSD says that when they left office in 2011, it was more like 234 million. Is there a cash flow problem?
There is zero cash flow problem. Let me tell you what the problem is, that people don't understand mathematics. If you look at where we are, the 60 million is just a snapshot of one particular day in the month, right? Earlier in the month, there might have been 40 or 50 million in the account. The 60 million is at the end of the month after salaries have been paid, etc., and after payments have been made, and that could go up to 50 or 60 million at any time in the calendar month. But add to that the amount that is in community care, because remember that my government has given to community care 100 million that the former administration stopped giving. So we don't have to put our hands in our pockets to pay community care payments to the trustees, because we have a piggy bank of 100 million pounds. We have 20 million pounds in the Gibraltar Savings Bank already accumulated. The GSD had zero. So if you add the 120 million pounds that we've put aside to the 60 million pounds there were on that day, you'd find that if we were the GSD and we were accounting in the GSD way, in other words, not putting that money there, if we had not given the 100 million to community care, if we had taken the 20 million that is in the savings bank reserve, you would have on that day, which might have been a low for the month of 16 million, we would have 136 million of reserves. So this is not about cash flow problems by any stretch of the imagination. It's very early in the electoral term. We've just succeeded in demonstrating that people back our way of doing things and have confidence in our management of the public finances. Believe me, by the time we get to the next general election, people will be not listening to any statements that the GSD might be making on public finances, and in fact, the GSD might even have stopped making them.